Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Family Caregiver Alliance for Waiting in Emotional Quicksand, the powerful role of anticipatory grief and ambiguous loss in dementia care. I'm Calvin Hu, Education Coordinator at FCA and your host. For 4 decades, FCA has been working across the Bay Area and the nation to improve the well-being of family caregivers. We offer support through consultations, classes, workshops, publications, retreats, research, and advocacy. If you'd like to learn more about us or access our online resources, please visit www.caregiver.org. Now for some quick housekeeping. During the webinar, your phones or mics are going to be muted, so if you have any questions, you can ask them by using the chat-style question box on your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We're also going to be asking you to give some feedback at the conclusion of the webinar, and we use this to help shape future programs and webinars. So I'd like to thank you in advance for filling those out. Today I'd like to welcome Kay Adams. Kay is a social worker, educator, writer, consultant, advocate, and trainer. Through her work, she educates, empowers, and supports people living with dementia, and of course the families, caregivers, and communities entrusted with their care. Kay currently works as a clinician in the Diagnostic Memory Clinic and Geriatric Psychiatry Department for Kaiser Permanente Colorado, which is in Denver. She's also a certified consultant and trainer for Teepa Snow's Positive Approach to Care. Kay has an extensive background in hospice, mental health, grief counseling, geriatric psychiatry, and dementia. She obtained her master's degree in social work at Augsburg College, which is in Minneapolis. So now that you know a little bit more about our today's guest, I'd like to turn things over to Kay.
Thank you so much, Calvin, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody who's out there in the audience. I'm Kay Adams, and I'm really happy to be here, especially in light of the fact that I have been really ill for the last week, and I had total laryngitis for 4 days last week and thought I wouldn't even make it to this webinar. So I sound a bit husky today, and but I'm going to do the best I can, and I'm very thrilled to be with you all. So welcome to Waiting in Emotional Quicksand, the powerful role of anticipatory grief and ambiguous loss. As Calvin said, I work currently for Kaiser Permanente in Denver in the Diagnostic Memory Clinic, where we basically diagnose different kinds of dementias, and you'll hear more about that. And I am a consultant and trainer for Positive Approach to Care with Teepa Snow. And for any of you out there who haven't heard of her, I totally encourage you to check out her website. It's Teepa, T-E-E-P-A, snow.com, because she is a huge advocate for families, professional caregivers, caring for someone living with dementia, and you'll learn a lot there. So now we're going to get into talking about waiting in emotional quicksand, and if you can do the next slide, Calvin. So I want to give you a little bit of information about my background. I've really had a front row seat to anticipatory grief for a long time. And I'm guessing a lot of you people on the phone call out there are going to know what that term means, anticipatory grief. But some of you may have never heard of this term before, and I certainly hadn't before I started in hospice. So anticipatory grief is the kind of grief that we start grieving way in advance of a loss. And when I worked in hospice for 8.5 years, I saw a lot of anticipatory grief. During those 8.5 years, all of my patients lived in nursing homes, assisted livings, memory care units, board and care homes. And so those were the environments I was in 40 hours a week. The patients I was working with were facing their own mortality because they knew they had a terminal illness. So they knew they were facing the end of their lives. The families attached to them and the friends attached to them were grieving in advance too, because they knew they were going to lose this loved one that they cared so much about. So I was also witness to their grief processes. And then when I came to Kaiser, the first 3 years I spent in Kaiser, I worked as a mental health therapist, and I worked with a broad selection of ages and types of people and problems, but I specialized a lot in grief counseling because that was really near and dear to my heart after my hospice work. The past 4 years I've spent in the Diagnostic Memory Clinic, and we are a little specialty clinic within Kaiser. And all the folks that get referred to us are 65 and older, and they all get referred to us by their primary care docs or another provider because there's an identified memory change or problem going on. So we have a skewed population off the top because the folks have already been identified as having something going on. So I work as part of an interdisciplinary team, and we have 2 appointments, an intake appointment, which is an hour and a half, and a follow-up appointment a few weeks later where we go over the results of the testing and give diagnoses. So essentially, we are in the bad news business in my job because over 90% of the people referred to us end up with some form of a dementia diagnosis that I'm part of helping deliver in an hour-long appointment, and then they're sent on their way to kind of figure out how to deal with that and how to cope. So you're going to have a little bit of a flavor for what I do in my work in a minute when we talk about the story of Rosie and Vince. But let's go on to our learning objectives for today. And we have 3 of them. We're going to describe the role that anticipatory grief and ambiguous loss play in the caregiving process. We're going to identify coping strategies, which are really important, to effectively deal with the multiple losses involved in being a caregiver for someone with dementia. And we're going to discuss the 7 rules of survival for how to get out of emotional quicksand as a caregiver. So let's start with a definition. Anticipatory grief is the emotional pain and sadness that arises far in advance of an expectant loss or death. We can have anticipatory grief about anything, about thinking we're going to lose a job, about thinking our child's going to go off to college and move away, about a divorce, about a death, about a change in our health. We don't have to wait till the event happens to grieve, and that's kind of a myth a lot of people operate under. I didn't really understand anticipatory grief, but when I started in hospice in the fall of 2001, 6 weeks into my job, my mom called me, and something sounded really wrong with her voice. I've never heard the term before, the tone in her voice before or after that day that I heard on that call. And she told me, she said, "Kay, I have some news I need to share." And I knew something terrible was going to come out of her mouth. And she said, "Your dad has been diagnosed with cancer. It's treatable but not curable." And at that moment, my anticipatory grief process started because it felt like the bottom just dropped out of my world as I knew it. I'd only been in hospice 6 weeks, but I knew that treatable and not curable meant terminal and that I was going to lose my dad. And the next 6 months until his death, I grieved every day, hours a day, at the thought of losing him. I was in anticipatory grief mode. In fact, I may have grieved harder and longer during those 6 months leading up to his death than I did in the years since, because I was just preparing myself for that loss. So anticipatory grief can also be the loss of someone you used to know, like in a dementia. When it changes them, it changes their personality and who they become. It may start at diagnosis or maybe long before that when those subtle changes begin to creep in that you start noticing. And then we're going to go to our next definition, which is ambiguous loss. And this is a newer term that's out there. And ambiguous loss refers to interacting with someone who's physically present with us, but who is not fully present socially or psychologically. This is a really common phenomena when working with someone who has a dementia, because the person may be with us, in the room, but they're unable to be themselves in social and emotional interactions in the way they've always been before the dementia disease set in. So when that happens, when there's these ambiguous losses, they're kind of like the lights on, no one's home at times. You're reminded of what you've lost all the time, and of the ground that's slipping away in that relationship. This is especially true in the middle and late stages of the disease, when the person is like, I am who I am, but I'm different. I'm changing. And those brain changes are really hard. So when someone's living with the dementia inside them, everyone around them is also living with dementia and impacted by that. And that can have huge repercussions in terms of ambiguous loss. So now we're going to move on to a story of Rosie and Vince, and hopefully you were all able to download this story because I think Calvin put it on the web page. But I'm going to read it to you for those who haven't. And this is basically a story made up of a composite of different patients and families that I've worked with over the years in the memory clinic, but I felt like it really illustrated points around anticipatory grief and ambiguous loss that we're here to talk about today. So if you want to put the next slide up, Calvin, while I'm talking about this story and going to read to you, can you do the next slide, Calvin? There you go. So while you're listening to me read the story, if you can be thinking about these questions, and we'll kind of talk about it afterwards, that will be helpful. So Rosie was a vibrant woman who came into the memory clinic intake appointment, dressed to the nines, right down to her designer glasses. She looked at least a decade younger than her 72 years would suggest. Rosie came accompanied by her husband of 45 years, Vince. You could tell by taking one look at them they were still madly in love after all this time together, and it was heartwarming to witness. Rosie was referred to the memory clinic for diagnostic testing due to memory changes. Rosie was a highly educated woman who held advanced degrees and had been at the top of her game in her chosen professional field before her retirement 4 years ago. Rosie's memory changes had accelerated since retiring, and her short-term memory had become severely impaired. Rosie was admittedly nervous about coming in for testing because dementia ran in her family, and Rosie was petrified that her own mental decline could be leading to that same eventual outcome. In the intake appointment, Rosie stated that a lot of her current distress was related to fretting about her husband's health. Vince had recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness and was living on borrowed time. Vince had his own stressors, not the least of which was worrying about Rosie's progressive memory changes that were now impacting her ability to be independent in many areas of her life. Most heart-wrenching for Vince was the loss of Rosie's ability to be an equal partner in their marriage in the way she'd always been, due to memory, mood, and functional changes along the way. So often now Rosie was physically present, but seemed more and more checked out in a world of her own that Vince didn't understand or know how to penetrate. Vince had a lot on his plate, but his love and dedication to Rosie's well-being by far took precedence over his own mortality concerns that day. When Rosie and Vince returned to the follow-up appointment a few weeks later, the news they dreaded most was delivered. Our team informed Rosie that testing results indicated she had a probable Alzheimer's disease, which was already in the moderate stages. Even though Rosie and Vince both secretly suspected that diagnosis would come, hearing the words spoken out loud pierced the fragile bubble of denial they'd been cautiously living in, and life as they knew it would never be the same again. So let's talk about these questions. So hopefully some of you, what you may have come up with for the first one about what anticipatory grief process might be at work for Rosie, hopefully you might have realized there might be more than one, because Rosie may be grieving, first of all, the loss of her husband Vince, who is her rock, grieving the loss of their companionship, of his health, and of his ability to care for her as her dementia gets worse because she's become more and more dependent on him. So she's grieving all of those losses, and at the same time, she's grieving this diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and that fear of losing herself due to the disease over time and losing control of her life along the way. And the second question, how do you think Rosie's anticipatory grief process for herself and her dementia diagnosis differs from the grief over Vince's terminal illness? Well, for herself, Rosie already knows what Alzheimer's looks like because she's seen it in her family. That's why she was petrified of coming in. She knows that it's a brain disease that can change any and all parts of a person and their ability over time. So that is a huge grief process that she's trying to grapple with in that moment. And for Vince, she's grieving the loss of her partner and her best friend and her companion and her caregiver. So they're two separate things, but they're both huge. And that last question is, how might Vince be experiencing ambiguous loss in his marriage to Rosie? Well, we heard him say that she's more checked out these days. She's had mood changes and memory changes and functional declines. He's having to take up more and more of the slack, and she's living in a world more often that he doesn't understand her, he doesn't know how to penetrate, and that's an ambiguous loss, that she's still there beside him, but she's just not as available to him as she used to be throughout their marriage, and that's another grief issue for him. So let's go on to the next slide. And these are really common signs and symptoms of anticipatory grief. And so when you're looking at this list and I'm talking about it, think about for yourself with the person that you care about who has dementia. Think about if you've been grieving and didn't even know it in advance. So a lot of times with anticipatory grief, people become really tearful. I know once I got the news about my dad's illness, I cried all the time. On a dime, I would just start crying out of the blue. I felt a lot of anger, like, why me? Why is this happening to my dad? Why is this happening to my family? This isn't fair, those kind of things. Feeling lonely, even though we still had him here, but I was anticipating his absence and the emptiness that would bring. Fearful of the future, how it would change our family. Feeling fatigued. I remember thinking, I never knew my bones could feel this tired as the grief made me feel during those months. Feeling numb, like you're in a bubble, like you're walking around and you look normal to people, but you don't feel normal on the inside. A lot of people experience anxiety and depression, guilt that this is happening, feeling guilty that they can't control this disease that's happening to someone they care about. They may have a desire to talk, or they may desire just to kind of go into their shell. Poor concentration is really common, as is forgetfulness. And I want to share a quote with you. There's a book I recently read that I really enjoyed called Relentless Goodbye, Grief and Love in the Shadow of Dementia. And it's written by a woman named Jenny Horst Burkholder. And it's about a 20-year process of being a caregiver for her husband, Nelson, who had Lewy body dementia. And the book, I think, was started out as a journal and then turned into a book. So sometimes she wrote just quotes, and sometimes she wrote dialogue, and sometimes she wrote kind of poetry. And I felt like this really spoke to anticipatory grief. People say I am strong. Lord, I want to be weak. I want to give up and let someone else take over. I want to cry out my grief and let someone else worry about what to do and how to do it. Worry about who is going to take care of everything. Worry about what will happen in the future. I am not strong. I only do what I have to do. I take in my loss and his loss and our children's loss and grieve it over and over until I come to some sort of ability to let go of the Nelson of the past and then cope with the present. Then I will start all over again, because by now he is able to do less than he was before, is present less than he was before, is gone farther from us than he was before, and now needs me more than ever before. That really speaks to that anticipatory grief. And so this next slide talks about grief, and I'm hoping many of you out there know who Brene Brown is. She is a multiple best-selling author. She's very famous from her doing her TED Talks. She's on Oprah all the time, and she's my social work hero out of Houston, Texas. She's written numerous books and done a lot of research on things like vulnerability, shame, and rising strong out of the ashes of our complicated lives. And in her book, Rising Strong, she also did some research on grief that I want to share a little bit with you today, because I think it really speaks to the subject we're talking about. This is a quote from her book. Grief is the emotion that we perhaps fear most. As individuals, we're afraid of the darkness grief brings. As a society, we've pathologized it and turned it into something to cure or get over. Owning our stories of heartbreak is a tremendous challenge when we live in a culture that tells us to deny our grief. And I can tell you from my hospice background and from the work I do now, I couldn't agree with that quote more. I do think it's hard in our culture to talk about because we're afraid of this subject. And her research also found that there were 3 foundational elements of grief that kept coming up over and over in the research. And those were loss, longing, and feeling lost. So we'll start with loss. In the research, what it showed, you can go to the next slide, thank you. While death and separation are tangible losses that we can associate with grief, what she found with her research participants, what they described losses that are more difficult to identify or describe. And those losses were things like loss of what could be, what our life was supposed to look like, what we thought it was going to be, the loss of normality, the loss of what we thought we knew or understood about something or someone. This wasn't supposed to happen. This isn't how it's supposed to go. As I'm certain many of you out there already know, caring for a person living with dementia means dealing with one loss after another after another. It is not just a death loss. It is all those subtle losses of dreams and what could have been along the way that make it an especially painful process for caregivers to navigate. And then there's longing. And in Brene's research, longing isn't a conscious thing. We're not aware of it. But it's this involuntary yearning for wholeness, for things to be like they used to be before the disease, for understanding, for meaning, for that opportunity to regain or even simply touch what we've lost. I want my person to be like they were last month or last year or 3 years ago. That longing, it's that emptiness in the pit of your stomach that you can't feel no matter what. I was longing already when my dad was dying. I gained 30 pounds during the 6 months from his diagnosis to his death in trying to fill that emptiness in my stomach, anticipating his death. That was that longing. And sometimes you can have these moments of upwelling or hidden landmines of grief that can come out of nowhere. at a stoplight, you just start bawling because someone's walking by that looks like your person, or someone asks you about your loved one, a question about them, like, are you celebrating your anniversary this year? And suddenly you start crying because you realize you haven't celebrated for 5 years because your partner doesn't even remember your anniversary anymore. Those kind of losses along the way. And I want to share another quote from you from Relentless Grief. A huge added challenge with Lewy body dementia is the fluctuating cognition. Nelson may be back today with higher function than yesterday, reminding you once again of how much has been lost and of happier times. Then an hour or a week later, an hour or a week later it's gone, and you face the same loss, the same grief, and the same letting go all over again. The doors are always open. I want to close the one that says, I can't accept this, and walk permanently through the I will accept this door. But about the time I think I've done that, I'm thrown back into anger and pain and grief, and I'm fighting my way back to the door of acceptance again. And that's longing. And then lastly, we have feeling lost. And I love this slide, and I'm hoping a lot of you out there can relate to this slide as well as I can. Because do you ever feel like you just have no idea where to go next as a care partner because you've never done this before and you're clueless? Are you not sure what steps to take in this land of uncharted territory called dementia, in which you're now existing as a caregiver? And do you ever feel like your loved one has slipped far away, or is somewhere you just can't relate to anymore? And do you ever just feel like throwing up your hands and screaming, I don't know, someone tell me what to do? That's feeling lost in your grief. So let's move on to one last thing in Brene's research that I really thought was vitally important. She tells us that grief requires us to reorient ourselves to every part of our physical, emotional, and social worlds. That's huge. I'm going to say that again. Grief requires us to reorient ourselves to every part of our physical, emotional, and social worlds. Talk about uncharted territory. And as care partners, we don't just do this onerous task once, but over and over again throughout the progression of the dementia. And no wonder we're tired. And her research showed that the more difficult it is for us to articulate or name or describe our experience of loss, longing and feeling loss, the more disconnected and alone we can feel. And I think that's so true of care partners for folks with dementia. Here's another quote from the book. The disconnect I feel with normal people is not unusual. I can't relate to their way of ordering the world. They can't relate to mine. I don't mark time by the same events as they do. If I mark time at all, I mark it by the losses and crises that litter the path of a caregiver. So another thing that came up in Brene's research was that we need coping strategies as caregivers. So writing down your experiences of heartbreak and grief can be really helpful. Making clear to yourselves what you are feeling so that you can articulate that to others. And I would add articulating it to others that get what you're going through, not people that have no clue, because that's not always most helpful. So let's move on to briefly talk about the stages of grief according to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. These are kind of foundational principles about grief from a pioneer in death and dying work. So we'll go through these briefly. The first stage of grief is denial, and I will go to the next slide. Is the cartoon on that one? Maybe not. There's a cartoon on the slide that didn't show up, but there's this little figure that says it's not denial. It's just I'm just very selective about the reality I accept, and I think that's perfect. It's a perfect description, because denial can be hoping that the person really isn't ill, expecting that they're going to get better even though they have a disease that we know is progressive, convincing yourself the person really hasn't changed, or attempting to normalize problematic behaviors. I see this every day over and over and over in my work in the memory clinic. Families will say, well, I think it's just old-timer's disease. It can't be dementia. I walk in the room all the time and forget what I'm there for. That's normal. Aren't you allowed to forget some things as you get older? Or they'll say, that's not, it's not bad. Dad can remember things from 50 years ago. So what if he can't remember things from 5 minutes ago? Does that really matter? So it's the denial that's going on. And the next stage is anger. And it is easy. I want to tell you right now that it's really easy to be angry when you're a caregiver for someone with dementia, because when they ask you the same questions 25 times in 5 minutes and don't remember your answer, you get angry, you get frustrated, because you're human. And you can begin to resent the demands of caregiving, resent family members who won't show up and help you, and feeling abandoned. And so this requires enormous time and energy as patients, and you're tired yourself. So it's easy to kind of get into that mode of, this isn't what I signed up for, and feel angry about it. And the next stage is bargaining or guilt. And this can look like, starting to question yourself. Gosh, did I do something to cause this illness? If I had just been kinder to them, if I'd been more patient, would they have not have gotten dementia? Feeling bad if you are actually having moments of joy in your life because you feel like you shouldn't because your loved one or friend has this dementia. Or feeling like a failure because you don't know what to do because no one's ever taught you because you weren't born with these skills inherently of how to deal with dementia. Wishing the person would go away, sometimes wishing they would die because this is so painfully hard and it's going on for so long. Or having unrealistic expectations of yourself. I should have done this, I should have done that, and being really hard on yourself. One of them that I hear a lot is, I promised my family member I would never put them in a nursing home, and now I've had to place them, and I feel so much guilt about that. That's a common one that comes up. And the next stage is depression. And I think we know from studies that a majority of caregivers out there tend to be women. And for, I think, a lot of time in our culture anyway, women are far more comfortable with being depressed and internalizing their anger than expressing it outwardly. And not that men can't do that too, but I think a lot of women get very depressed as caregivers. They feel overwhelmed by the loss, crying frequently, withdrawing from social events, kind of going into their own bubble, or perhaps needing to reach out more to other people because you feel so lost and alone. Withholding emotions, stuffing them, you don't want to show them, or maybe they're just coming out all over the place, coming out sideways and you can't even stop them. So other symptoms of depression can include having a hard time focusing, sleeping too much or too little, changes in appetite, increased irritability, feeling worthless or helpless or hopeless, loss of interest or apathy of things you used to enjoy you don't care about anymore, that persistent sad, anxious, or empty feeling in the pit of your stomach. And we know that people that are care partners for folks with dementia are at a much higher risk of developing depression than non-caregivers are for all the reasons we've already been talking about. And the last stage of acceptance is acceptance. And I like to think of acceptance as kind of like a baseball game. Acceptance is home plate. So you hit the ball and you run the bases. You run past denial and anger and bargaining and depression, and wow, you get to touch home base and score a run. Woohoo, you made a home run and you've reached acceptance. The problem with acceptance is you can't stay at home base. You just get to visit. You just get to touch it. So you have to keep going up to bat over and over again through those other stages of denial and anger and bargaining and depression over and over again in order to reach home plate again. So we wax and wane in our ability to be at acceptance, and I think this is especially true with dementia because it keeps changing. So maybe you've now accepted they can't talk and communicate very well anymore, and maybe you've come to terms with that, but then 6 months or a year later, now they can't dress themselves anymore, and that's a whole other grief process you have to go through. And then they can't figure out how to do the finances anymore. They can't figure out how to do their meds anymore. They can't cook anymore. Whatever the loss is, you have to go through this over and over again. And this is another great quote from the book, Relentless Grief, that I really think speaks to this. She writes, "The acceptance is like a greased watermelon. Just when you think you have a good hold, it slides to the floor at your feet, messy, undone, and sweet, but not very tempting. Do you want to try again, or do you want to give up? Somehow I keep coming back to that endless supply of greased watermelons and try once more to hang on to the wholeness and the sweetness of greater acceptance." All right, so let's move on to talking about quicksand. And I have to tell you, I came up with the title of this talk long before I ever came up with the content of this talk. And the term just came to me about emotional quicksand. It just resonated with me in my work. And one day I was driving to work in rush hour in Denver, which takes a very long time here. And I started thinking, gosh, I should Google quicksand. I really know nothing about it other than what you saw in the old horror movies. I've thankfully never really been in quicksand in real life, but I wondered if by chance quicksand had anything to do with caregiving. And in my research I found, oh my gosh, it really does. It's pretty amazing. And this is the definition of quicksand is loose, wet sand that yields easily to pressure and sucks anything resting or falling into it. So let's talk about how to avoid emotional quicksand. And we'll go to the next slide. And I want to tell you right now that as care partners for someone with dementia, it's great to have a goal to avoid emotional quicksand, but I don't know if it's achievable because this illness is so difficult and so long. But if you're going to try to avoid emotional quicksand, first you got to know, what are the common quicksand areas to watch out for in the first place. So let's talk about them. So the next slide talks about common quicksand areas, and this is just a very small list. One of it can start with receiving a diagnosis of dementia. The person you care about has just been diagnosed, and you feel your feet starting to sink, right, in that emotional quicksand. The loss of normalcy of your life. It's not the way it used to be. Your roles are shifting. Your relationships are shifting. You may not have time to yourself like you used to have. The loss or change in the relationship is a big one for people. Loss of driving privileges, huge in our setting. Loss of financial stability if someone can't work anymore because of their dementia. Loss of independence or hope for the future that you thought was going to be and now it's going to look different. These are all really common quicksand areas. So then let's move on to the next slide, which is talking about looking for ripples. So if you can look at that slide, you see that sinkhole up ahead. So you want to be on the lookout for ground that appears unstable. And here's the tricky part about this. In order to be on the lookout, that means you have to be looking ahead. That means you have to be proactive, right? But if you're in denial and saying this isn't happening, you're not going to be proactive. You're not going to be thinking about the possible pitfalls and problems that could be coming in your future. You're going to not be thinking ahead to those bumps in the road. And those bumps and those ripples and those unstable times are going to come if you are caring for someone with a dementia. The grief is going to come. So my job in the memory clinic, I've become more and more straightforward and assertive over the last 4 years, and I don't dance around the subject nearly as much as I used to with families. And I say to them all the time, this is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when your loved one is going to need more care, supervision, maybe even a move to a higher level of care like an independent living or assisted living or a nursing home or memory care unit. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So start planning now when things are not in the crisis mode, and you can put plans B, C, and D in your back pocket for when you need them. Otherwise, what happens is we become reactive, and then we have an event that just tips the scale into a crisis situation, and none of us are capable of thinking and planning at our best when we're in crisis. So we want to be aware and on the lookout for those ripples. And the next slide talks about we want to test the ground in front of you with your walking stick. So think about actual quicksand. You want to put that stick out there to see if the ground in front of you is stable or if your stick starts sinking, right? So I think about a walking stick metaphorically like a close friend. Having a close friend, a family member, a support group, your faith, whatever it is that represents your walking stick, to have with you if you become stuck, and to tap that ground in front of you to make sure it's stable. Have them by your side. Because if you're in emotional quicksand, the few seconds that it takes to test that ground in front of you could literally make the difference between a messy wrestling match in emotional quicksand and a safe hike on solid mental ground. And that's big. All right, so let's go to the next slide. I've already mentioned that in an ideal world, we'd avoid emotional quicksand, but I've also alluded to the fact that I think it's really tough to do when you're a caregiver for someone with dementia, because it's just a very challenging illness to be a caregiver for. So these are actual rules of how to get out of real-life quicksand that I researched, that I took some poetic liberties with to meld to fit our content about being a caregiver and the emotional quicksand that we get into. So these are the 7 rules for survival. Whether you're up to your ankles, your knees, your waist, or even your neck, these should help. So the first survival tip I'm going to give you is don't panic. If you look at this woman's face, she is panicked. Think about real quicksand. Think about if you're in it. And think about the emotional quicksand you live in as a caregiver. When we panic, we don't think well. Our brain doesn't work well. We don't make good decisions. So don't panic, and just know that your feelings of anxiety and fear and overwhelm are normal, because dementia is a tough disease. Feeling overwhelmed and anxious and fearful are normal. Feeling panicky is normal. But just what what you want to do is find an outlet for that so you can express it, whether that's journaling, whether it's a support group, a faith community, whatever that looks like. You want to reach out to that so that you have that support to avoid panic and sinking into that quicksand. The next rule for avoiding getting out of emotional quicksand is if you're wearing something heavy. So picture yourself wearing a backpack, okay? If you're wearing a backpack that represents loads of grief and guilt and regret, mentally unstrap that backpack and drop it. Because if you were in real quicksand, you wouldn't want that heavy backpack weighing you down. And you don't want that emotional backpack weighing you down. We need to let go of that. And this is really important. This next point is that understand this is real grief. This is real grief. This is not pseudo grief. This is not watered down grief. This is as real as it gets being a caregiver for someone with a dementia, because it's loss after loss after loss after loss, year after year after year after year. And if anybody on the planet is an expert on grief, it's you all. And so what's important is to figure out ways to let go of that grief periodically. You build this into your schedule so that it doesn't stop you in your tracks and you start to sink. And dropping everything, at least daily, that could look like prayer, meditation, exercise, having coffee with a friend, watching a movie, whatever it takes, just to periodically get away from it and drop that heavy load so that you can move on. The third rule of getting out of emotional quicksand is if you feel your feet or your spirit even getting stuck and you start feeling yourself sinking, you want to take steps backwards and reassess the quicksand before it takes hold. And I love this slide. The optimist, someone who figures that taking a step backward after taking a step forward is not a disaster, it's a cha-cha. So I love that reframe on that. So if you feel your feet or your spirit getting stuck, you want to step back, because sometimes we're too close to the big picture and we can't see it. And we need to step back and get a fresh perspective. The fourth rule of escaping emotional quicksand, you see this guy, he's laying in the quicksand. So this sounds counterintuitive, but you want to lay back, relax, and breathe. Lay back, relax, and breathe. I would normally be modeling some nice deep breathing for you, but when I do that now, I go into coughing fits, so I'm going to spare you that. But learning to do deep breathing is a really, really important and vital technique to learn as a caregiver, and it can really help lower your stress. So you want to sit down and lean back and relax. And it really lowers the cortisol levels or the stress hormones in your brain when you do deep breathing, and that helps us think better and remain calm and buoyant in those hard times. The fifth rule of survival is taking your time, which sounds strange if you think of that you're sinking in quicksand. You don't really think about taking your time, but if you get frantic and you're flailing around in that quicksand, it's only going to make matters worse and hurt your cause. So you want to take it slow so that the steps you do take in that quicksand really count when it matters. And I know as a caregiver, you're overwhelmed and rushed with all the tasks that need to be done in your 36-hour day. And you actually have to build in time in your schedule to get things done. But even so, if we can, encourage you to not be frantic and to take your time, you're going to gain so much more ground quickly than being frantic in your efforts. And the sixth rule is to use a stick. And again, a walking stick can be a support person, your faith, a support group, whatever that looks like for you. But you want to carry a walking stick anytime you're in quicksand country. And if you're going to be a caregiver for someone with dementia, I would argue you're going to be in quicksand country a lot of the time. And it's really helpful to shift your focus at times from thinking about all the losses that you're encountering. It's easy to get stuck there. Now they can't drive, now they can't do the finances, now they can't help with meals, now they can't work. But you want to shift that focus periodically to what can they still do? What do you still have left? To celebrating the relationship, to celebrating those key moments that happen along the way that you really have to focus on and pay attention to and celebrate in that moment, and not just everything that you've lost, or you'll drive yourself crazy in this process. And the other thing you need to do is cry and grieve the loss of what was. What was yesterday? What was 6 months ago? What was 3 years ago? Cry and grieve that loss. And only if you do that, can you really be effective as a caregiver and move forward, because you have to keep constantly adjusting to what is the new normal now. And the seventh rule of getting out of emotional quicksand, is taking frequent breaks. And I know this is easier said than done, because if anyone on the planet needs a break, it's people that are caring for someone with a dementia. You guys need breaks more than anybody. And they're not easy to come by. You literally have to schedule it, and sometimes that's almost impossible to plan. So this is a disease that's a marathon and not a sprint. When my dad was diagnosed with cancer, it was from diagnosis to death, it was 6 months. That was relatively quick rather than a 15-year prognosis or a 10-year with a dementia. So you need to build in breaks, and you need to build in two kinds of grief breaks. You need to build in the kind of breaks where you actually grieve, let yourself cry, let yourself wail, talk to somebody about how sad you are, let it out. And you also have to have times where you literally take a break from grief, where you're not thinking about it, where you're watching a movie, where you're out with friends, where you're feeling joy and you're feeling normal. You need those kind of breaks too, to re-energize you and fill up your emotional bucket so you can keep going forward. And I threw in one last bonus rule for you here, which is rule number 8, which is laugh through your tears. Anybody who knows me well knows I love to laugh. I grew up in a family with a great sense of humor. But what I didn't know till recently about laughter is it increases endorphins, those feel-good hormones, those feel-good chemicals in our brains that, like after we exercise, we always feel better. Well, laughter increases those endorphins in our brain, so it can actually relieve stress, smooth tension, improve our immune system, and relieve pain, even when you're laughing through your tears. And there's a stress hormone called cortisol that is, with caregivers, is very high. Studies have shown that caregivers run at a 50% higher cortisol or stress hormone level, higher than the average person. So I would encourage you to laugh as much and as frequently as possible, because it's not only good for you physically, but it's good for you mentally and spiritually as well. And then the next slide just talks about being in resistance and denial. And I will be the first to admit that being in denial and resistance is very tempting. To not think about it, we don't want to face it. We want to avoid, like Brene Brown talked about, we want to avoid grief and loss and pain. We'd rather talk about Botox and staying young and never talking about the fact that we're all going to die at some point. But I think that being in resistance and denial can only make matters worse in the end, and actually makes your job as a care partner even more challenging than it already is, and you don't need any more challenges on your plate. So the next slide talks about reaching out to other people who can understand and who can help. And that may take different forms, whatever's comfortable for you, but you want to reach out to other people. This is not a disease you want to stay isolated. This is a disease that it takes a village. Truly, it takes a village. One person alone cannot do this till the end. It's not possible. So you want to have a community that can help you. Again, you want to celebrate those good moments and grieve the moments that can no longer be. And you want to grieve those moments not in front of the person that you care about who's living with dementia, but away from them, so it doesn't add to their grief and distress. And you want to use that grief, if possible, to build inner strength as care partners. This is another great quote from the book, Relentless Grief, but it's in the foreword section of the book, and it's written by Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who's a pioneer in grief work, has written many, many books on grief, and he's out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And the quote is, "Anyone who has ever been a caregiver can attest that love is a verb. To truly love someone means to act on that person's behalf in compassionate, selfless, and kind ways. No one understands the maxim, love is a verb, better than caregivers to those with dementia. It's important to keep in mind that love and grief are two sides of the same coin, and that grief, too, requires action." And the last slide I have is just talking about how all of you out there have your own unique journeys of grief. None of us do it the same. Depending on a relationship to that person, you know, if it's our husband, if it's our brother, our sister, our friend, our neighbor, whoever it is that we're attached to, we're all going to have our unique relationships. And a last quote from this book that I found powerful is, "Looking forward with hope and promise is necessarily a right of the young. Perhaps waiting in loss is the passport to maturity and wisdom. The more we try to distance ourselves from the pain, the farther down the road to nowhere we will get. So I will visit past memories as I can and wade through present loss as I must. It is the path of a caregiver who wants to avoid going nowhere." So as caregivers, you know, you all have your unique journeys, and I would just encourage you to embrace that grief and face the pain, because it can actually fuel you for the long journey of caregiving ahead. And the last slide, I'm sorry, is I just want to thank you for being here today. And I want to thank you for every one of you out there for what you do, for who you are, and for really how you care and show up in this world. It is never more important than now. And in my opinion, there's really no more important role that any of us are ever going to play on this planet than being a personal or professional caregiver for someone. There's not a role that's more selfless, vital, satisfying, or really difficult than this. So I want to thank you for all you do and all the ways you do it, both personally and professionally. And I really want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with you today. And I'm going to turn it back to Calvin.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kay. I really appreciate you spending the time with us, I guess, this afternoon now. But also, of course, sharing the story about your father, which I understand is probably a pretty personal thing for you. But I do appreciate you also sharing that with us and all the listeners. We do have a couple questions, so I kind of just want to get into it. I guess easiest first. The book, I think it was it Relentless Grief? We had okay. And who is the author again?
Her name is, let me get back to that, Ginny Horst Burkholder, Burkholder. It's Relentless Goodbye, Grief and Love in the Shadow of Dementia.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, we had a lot of questions about what the actual title of the book was. The second question, let's see. Okay, so I have a caregiver, it looks like, who is taking care of their elderly mother. Looks like recently diagnosed with dementia, and it's like a younger daughter and her siblings. So it's a whole bunch of the adult children, trying to taking care of the elderly mother. And I guess right now it seems that the other siblings are maybe more on the denial. Denial part of the spectrum, which she's maybe more on the acceptance. So I guess her question for you was: is there a way she can maybe help out her siblings, maybe come to grips with this, or is it really something they have to all kind of get to on their own time and their own way?
That's a perfect question. It's a really good one. You may have already answered it for yourself with that. I think when it comes to these stages of grief, it would be nice to think we could kind of move people along at the pace we wish they were going through those stages of grief. But in my experience, we really can't. We can nudge them, though. We can gently, lovingly nudge them. So, I try to do that in the memory clinic, and I would encourage you to do that with your siblings. Just by sharing your experiences, not by telling them what they should be feeling or what stage of grief they should be in, because that's never going to get you anywhere, but by saying, gosh, this is what I'm noticing about Mom. This is the changes that I'm grieving. This is what I've seen, be different over the last 6 months or year or 5 years or whatever it's been. And so I'm really accepting of this because it seems more obvious to me. And you just kind of share your own experiences, not force the agenda, not cram it down somebody's throat, but just by using I statements and using your own reality as when you're talking about it, and then just invite them to share where they're at. And I think it's very seldom that all family members are on the same page at the same time. And it shifts because you may not stay in acceptance. You may move back to denial or anger or depression or bargaining. So it's going to shift in and out, and it's a very fluid process. So I would just say, kind of be patient with the process, lovingly accept people where they are, and try to do your best to move through your own phases and support them in theirs.
Sure. Yeah, and definitely, I remember you mentioning it, and it stuck out in my head that it is fluid, and that it's maybe you don't want to get too think it well. If like the baseball metaphor, I've gotten to acceptance. I've kind of accepted what's going on, but then you don't want them to get frustrated when something else happens and they realize that it's they kind of have to start all over again when they thought maybe they've got to this big acceptance stage, and now things maybe can get a little more normal for them. Yeah, 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 and I think we can all visualize what it's like to try and hold on to a greased watermelon, as a metaphor. Okay, let's see. We have another question. This is again is kind of right in the meat of this presentation, I think. This is someone who. Okay, so they have friends and coworkers, of course, well-meaning, and the person who's asking the question, I think, realizes that they're well-meaning, but they don't really seem to understand, what she's going through. And I guess as you mentioned before, I think, and she said specifically about Lewy body dementia, but in this case, her husband who has dementia can, sometimes when friends are visiting or other family members, they arrive and he seems kind of okay. But they don't, they're not with him all the time, and they don't see sometimes when, he's really maybe gotten to a stage where it's a little more advanced. So, all this kind of, well-meaning but also kind of lack of understanding is really, frustrating her. And I guess as you mentioned, it was, it can be isolating too. So would there be any advice you could give her in terms of her trying to maybe explain a little bit better what she's really going through?
I think that's another great question, and I want to first of all, validate the reality you're living, because what I learned in hospice is that we each have our own unique grief journeys, and I really have a prejudice that I don't think we as a culture in the United States do really great about grief. It's not included in the curriculum. I went through my master's degree in social work, never had a single class on grief. At the time, but I may be aging myself as well. But I think that it's not uncommon for people not to get it. So we hear the comment a lot like, well, why are you grieving? Your loved one's still here. Your husband's still here, right? He's not dead. Why are you grieving? And what they don't get is that there's all of these stages of grief along the way that they're not experiencing and living moment by moment, week by week, year by year that you're living. And so they're just lacking, they're ignorant. They're lacking understanding. They're lacking understanding of the reality that you're living. So what I would invite you to do in those situations is invite them to listen to your story, even if they don't understand the perspective. Say, can I just tell you what it's like from my shoes? Can I tell you how hard it is that my husband can't remember when we got married, sometimes can't remember how many kids that we have, can't remember vacations that we took, which were the best highlights of our whole marriage, and using real examples, poignant examples that bring up emotion for people that they could relate to, and use those examples to kind of say, I know that you maybe can't understand it from my standpoint, but think about it if it was you and if it was your husband, how might you feel if you couldn't relate to him in these ways anymore? And then when people start trying it on in their own skin, they can start to feel it a little bit and imagine what it might be like. So even though they may not get it in the same way, they may be closer to getting it than they were before.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. And again, I think you mentioned about how it's, some of these well-meaning, the well-meaning comments, or even, innocent comments, can really just kind of bring everything rushing back, and just kind of out of the blue, and then bring it all back to reality, or bring these feelings back again. Now, I don't. This next question, I'm not sure if it's from a professional who might be leading the support group, or if it's one of the caregivers who participates, but they're wondering if this might be a good topic actually in a caregiver support group in terms of something to bring up.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I was just on the phone yesterday with a wife. We just diagnosed her husband with Alzheimer's 3 weeks ago. And at the very end of it, we had a 45-minute conversation about all the changes and stuff that are going on. And she was just very matter of fact. And one of the things she was looking into was, getting involved in a support group, but she wasn't really sure she needed it. And then she started to say something to me at the end of the conversation and stopped herself short. And I said, what were you going to say to me just now? And she goes, I'm too embarrassed to even say it out loud. And I said, well, don't worry, the only person listening is me. So tell me what you're going to say. And she said, well, I feel selfish and guilty for feeling this way, but I feel so sad. I feel like I'm grieving my husband, and I think, why should I be grieving? He's the one with the disease. So she didn't even know, she didn't have that awareness that grief is part of this. It's one big ball of grief, if you ask me, from start to finish with the dementia. And so bringing this up in support groups and just making people aware that they are grieving and that it's acceptable. In fact, let's celebrate that. Let's do it. let's help them by letting them work through their grief, because it's going to add years to their life if they do. So I think it's a fabulous thing to bring up in support groups.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and certainly it would be a way to, kind of spread the message and kind of the information about the ambiguous loss and anticipatory grief, just so people can kind of have it in mind and kind of help them work through their own caregiving journeys. We have another question. Let's see. So this question is, sorry, I must admit I lost my train of thought a little bit here. Oh, okay, that's what it was. The question was, in terms of, how you mentioned quicksand, if you have something heavy, get rid of it, don't go into quicksand with heavy loads. So, and in keeping with the presentation, if you have, emotional baggage or, grief or regret or guilt, you have to do your best to get rid of it. But probably like being able to take time off for yourself, it's probably one of those very tricky things to actually do in practice. Do you have any advice for people in terms of ways they might be able to let go of those burdens?
Well, I think yes, and like I kind of mentioned in that slide, I mean, it could be going to a support group, it could be having coffee with a friend, it could just be confessing to somebody, out loud, this sucks. I say it all the time, dementia sucks. Let's just be real, dementia sucks. This is killing me. This is a really hard disease. This is so sad. As simple as that, because people feel guilty saying those things out loud. And I want to encourage people to say them out loud, or say them out loud on paper in your journal. Get them out of you. Getting involved in support groups, or getting involved in things like this, these webinars, getting involved with resources like Teepa Snow's website, or finding out more to educate yourself, because I think the thing that's hard about this disease is people are not innately born with the tools, of how to be a caregiver for a disease like this. And so once you realize that you're doing the best you can with the tools you have, it's easier to let go of that regret and that guilt. And then you can just say, I'm doing the best with what I can, but there's tools out there, there's education out there, there's knowledge out there that I can gain that's going to make my job better and my role better, and basically have a positive outcome on me and my loved one. So I would just encourage you to take advantage of those resources out there in the community, and those activities that are going to, even if it's for 5 minutes a day, to drop that baggage. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Start with 5 minutes and work up to an hour as a good goal.
Yeah. I guess just like exercising, you have to kind of work up to that kind of emotional hardiness to be able to really kind of kind of go 180 and go from caregiving mode to kind of self-care mode, which is not really obvious. Certainly I'd like to also mention, since you did mention, education, at Family Caregiver Alliance, we're really, we do our best to, advocate for caregivers, but also make sure they have the information, because there's really not a lot of information out there, and it's just kind of expected they're able to, jump into this and kind of know what to do. I just want to mention our website, caregiver.org. We have a lot of fact sheets. We also have, specifically on this topic, a fact sheet on ambiguous loss. If anyone is interested to learn more about the topic, it's the simplest way would probably be to go to our website, caregiver.org, and just search for caregiving and ambiguous loss. That's the name of the fact sheet. We do have time for one more question, and I think I am going to, I hope you don't mind, take that one for myself. I had a question that was kind of bouncing around in my head. I also appreciate you sharing all the kind of information about your background, so we kind of know where you're coming from, both professional and personal. But I guess in the maybe the more the professional realm, seeing all these people, having to break all this bad news, talking to so many people who are, I guess, just maybe just starting, or maybe just officially starting, in terms of being told by a professional that this is coming, this is the reality. Do you have any? I know there's one big tip about planning ahead. If you don't plan ahead, if you're not looking ahead, you're gonna be reacting. You're not going to be able to to try and head things off at the pass. Do you have any other kind of professional wisdom that you think, or I guess maybe common mistakes that people often make? Since again, this is something that no one's really trained for, and they're just kind of thrown into it. Yeah, or I guess just through your through working with so many caregivers and maybe seeing some common mistakes. One being, of course, or mistakes or common pitfalls. One being not necessarily being able to plan ahead or thinking ahead. Are there other kind of common themes that that people might think about in terms of making their lives a little less hard?
Well, I don't know if this is going to be a little less hard, because what came to mind when you were talking is that I think a lot of people, even after we tell them a diagnosis about dementia, think that it's only short-term memory changes. Mm-hmm. And so they only prepare themselves mentally that it's a short-term memory change disease. And all of the dementias progress, and all of the dementias at this point don't have a cure. And they're ultimately brain failure, where different parts of your brain are dying over time. And it can change every part of a person, their personality, their mood, their functional ability. And so even though this sounds very heavy to end on, I really think it's important for people to understand that this is more than a short-term memory disease, because if you're only thinking you have to walk a mile and you have to walk 1,000, you're not prepared. Right?
Sure,
and so you have to prepare yourself, and then you're going to what tools am I going to need to walk that 1,000 miles? Very different than if I only had to go for a mile. And then you think, what village can I take with me? And so I think that's the other thing, is just to really know that common mistakes are people think they can do it themselves. I took my vows seriously, or I promised my parent or my friend or whatever. But just know that there are resources out there, and that it truly, truly takes a village to be a care partner for this. And that's not because you're not good. It's just that no one can do this alone. And so I would say be aware of what the disease really is, really understand the ramifications that can come so that you're not caught off guard, and then start surrounding yourself with a community of people that can help support you and your loved one in this process, because it's vital.
Sure. Fantastic. Well, it looks like we are right at the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank Kay Adams again for joining us today. Kay and I were talking, I guess, earlier in the week about her voice, and she was mentioning to me that, of course, as a social worker, you really need to be able to talk to people. So I do appreciate. Yes, that's exactly what you said, but I didn't necessarily want to say it that way. But she's been conserving her voice. She's been drinking tea. She really wanted to be able to talk to everybody today. So I am very grateful. You can hear that she's on the mend, but not quite there. So a stellar effort to be with us today, and I really do appreciate that. And of course, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. The webinars, the FSA webinars are actually a free and continuing service. You can find out more about our next webinar on our website, which is, again, caregiver.org. So thank you for joining us again this afternoon. Thanks again, Kay, for joining us partially ill, partially well. The webinar is now concluded. We hope to see you all next webinar, and have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today.